Hello, welcome to this family history class on evidence analysis. Let me share my screen and then we can begin. Today we're going to talk about evidence and how to determine which piece of evidence is correct or the most likely to be accurate. Evidence is really important when we do genealogical research. We want to provide evidence to prove or show that something we've recorded is correct. Oh, whoops. One of the reasons, actually we have three reasons here that we use evidence or sources, helps us to avoid duplication, resolve conflicting information, and allows us to figure out which is the most accurate information. A source that contains evidence can be a variety of things when we do genealogical research. We could have a document, that's the most common, like a birth certificate or death certificate. We could have a photograph, a letter, a journal entry, an interview, a tombstone, a book. There are so many things that we use as evidence in doing genealogical research. Okay, I'm going to be sharing 6 evidence words that we will use to evaluate our sources. And the first word is original. We want to determine if our source is an original source. One of the clues that it's an original source usually is that it has handwriting on it. So this example of a handwritten letter, or this certificate of marriage that has handwriting there showing that they filled out this form, usually indicates it's an original source. We always would prefer to have an original source in its original form. This original material is most often very accurate. Okay, now opposite of original, we have derivative. Derivative or compiled are considered the same. Now, this could be something that has been indexed, transcribed, extracted, or even compiled. Think of a genealogy book that has been compiled and put together. So these are all one step or more away from the original. So when we first look at our source, the thing that we can touch, we determine whether it's an original source or a derivative source. Here's an example of a book that's a derivative or compiled source. Okay, so once you determine whether your source is original or derivative, the next thing we do is we look at the information within that source. And the information can be primary or secondary. And there will be some sources that actually have both. So primary information was provided by an eyewitness. Secondary information was provided by somebody that heard about the event, or by an eyewitness, but many years after the event. Because sometimes our memory changes or is forgetful. Okay, here's an example of primary. We have a birth certificate here, and this is a government document that was created at the time of birth by an eyewitness to the birth. Usually a parent, a mother, fills out this document and it's signed by the midwife or the physician. So this is actually the best source we could have for the date of birth and the place of birth. This would be ideal. If we could always have birth, marriage, or death certificates for everything, that would be the perfect and most correct information. Now, secondary information may also be on a document, a government document. In this case, we have a marriage certificate, and the information about the marriage will be primary, but the information about how old the bride and groom are, or where they were born, that is going to be secondary. because the people providing that information were not eyewitnesses to the event, and that event occurred many years ago. Okay, so we want to know whether our source is primary, actually whether our source is original or derivative, and then we look at the information to see if it's primary or secondary. Now, the third thing we do is look at the evidence, and the evidence can be direct or indirect. Now, direct evidence would specifically answer our question. For example, if our question is, when and where was this person born? And maybe even what was their accurate name? A birth certificate could clearly answer that and directly tells us the name of the child, the date of the birth, and the place of the birth. Now, it stands alone, and we don't have to do anything to the information. However, indirect evidence does not clearly give us the answer. For example, let's think about a census record that gives us a year and a state of how old, actually, it doesn't give us a year, it tells us how old the person is, and it tells us what state they were born in. So a census record indirectly tells us the birth information. We actually have to do something with that age. We have to calculate and figure out that they were born about a certain year and then a certain place. Missouri is kind of, or whatever the state is kind of a large thing, not very specific. Another example of indirect evidence is when we look at some of the earlier census records, we might find a man and a woman close to the same age living in a household with young children. We assume that they are a family, but there is nothing that clearly tells us this is a husband and wife and children until the later census years. Okay, so these are the evidence words. We have original, so a document can be, a document or evidence. A source can be original or derivative. Then the information within that record or that source can be primary or secondary. And in some cases, we have both pieces of information. Then we have direct or indirect, that the information is clearly answers our question or does not, and then we have to do something to it. Okay, other things to consider when you're looking at your source. Think about who created this source. When was it created? Was somebody motivated to create it? What was the purpose? Was the source created at the time of the event or many years later? How far removed from the original is it? And was there anybody with an interest in making the record different than it should accurately be? What does the record clearly state? And what does the record imply? How does this record compare with other information already known? These are all good questions to think about when you are evaluating evidence. Now, one thing I would like to add here is that we consider digital images of a letter or a document as if they were the original. We don't consider them as a derivative. So just keep that in mind as you're evaluating your evidence. Okay, we want to draw reliable conclusions. It's not about how many sources are attached. It's about the quality of the sources. One good source may be enough in some cases. In other cases, you might need multiple sources to prove a conclusion. We ideally want original sources with primary information. They are records that were created at or near the time of the event, and they were created by an eyewitness to the event. So these are going to be the most accurate. Derivative sources with secondary information are less reliable. And so we can use these sources, but we always would like to get back to the original. If we're looking at a database or an index, we always want to look at the original record to see if there's more information or if it's more accurate. Okay, we need to examine carefully each piece of evidence. Let's go ahead and look at some examples now. Here we have a tombstone. So if we think about evaluating evidence, we want to talk about the thing that we can touch. In this case, it would be the tombstone. So the tombstone can either be original or derivative. In this case, we can say it's original. Now, the case of when it might be a derivative is if a tombstone is replaced. That would be a derivative, not the original. Okay, so let's consider that this tombstone is an original. Now we want to look at the information that's on the tombstone. Is it primary or secondary? Let's go ahead and read the information. This is a tombstone for Annie M., wife of Frank Stupp. She was born March 10th, 1884, and died March 27th, 1912. So the information about her death is likely primary. And if we think about when this tombstone was placed or created, it was probably placed at or near the time of her death. And so this would tell us that the death information is likely very accurate. However, you may notice that there's also another person listed on this tombstone. We have Ira F. Stupp, born September 11th, 1867, died January 21st, 1909. Now, we don't have anything here that tells us the relationship of Ira to Annie or Frank. However, we could indirectly come to some conclusions. Likely they're related because they're on the same tombstone. And looking at the age difference, it's possible that Ira could be a child. Now, Ira died before Annie, so we can assume that the tombstone was placed at the death of Annie and that Ira's information was added at that time. Also, something I would suggest that you pay attention to are the tombstones surrounding. Often there are family members buried nearby. And you'll notice that there is a tombstone that says Minnie Stupp nearby. It says she was born 1874 and died 1937. Okay, let's keep going. Here we have another tombstone. This is a cemetery in Baltimore, and it has a lot of old tombstones, and you can see that some of these are broken. So if you look closely, which is hard to do, you can see that some of those tombstones, the information that was put on those is worn away. Now, among these tombstones, you'll notice that there's one here that is actually made of granite. You will not see granite tombstones before 1900. However, people will sometimes replace the broken tombstones with a granite tombstone or something newer. And then remember, when they're trying to take the information from the original tombstone, it's worn away, so the information may not be collected accurately. So that granite tombstone would be considered a derivative, and the information may not be as accurate as the original one. Sometimes tombstones we have a double, and usually they're husband and wife. And sometimes you will have one of the spouses that has died and one of the spouses, their death date is not there. Think of the process. When the tombstone was placed, in this case, it was probably placed when John died in 1967. And then the information about John's birth and about Polly was added at that time. So Polly probably provided the information about her own birth. And then it looks like Polly died years later, and that was probably added later. Okay, let's look at a census record. Here we have a census. This is probably the 1850 or 60 census, and we have people listed. We do not know any relationships of how they're related or connected, but we make assumptions. For the first two entries, we see William H. Griffiths, who is 30, a miller and born in New York. And then we see there's a line, Josephine, and so we assume that that's Josephine Griffiths. She's 29 and she's keeping house, and the ditto means she was born in New York. We assume that that is a married couple. There's nothing there to tell us for sure, but we're making that assumption. That's an indirect conclusion. Here is another census. This one is from, this one's actually from 1900. But this one gives the relationship. So if we look at Alman March, who is on the first line there, he is the head of household. And then we have Felicia, who is his wife, and it clearly states that's his wife. And then we have Adelbert, who is the son, Ray, who is a son, and we have Lucy Andrews, who is a niece, also living with them. So that clearly and directly tells us their relationship. And just as a matter of information, the census gives us primary information about where the family or the person was living on the date the census was taken. Everything else is secondary. Here we have a birth record. This is a birth record for Roger George Hamstreet, who was born the 28th of April, 1913. His parents are William Earl Hamstreet and Elizabeth Ruth Walcott. Now, the information about this would be considered an original because it was created at the time of the birth. The information in this document that is considered primary would be the name of the child, the date and the place of the birth. The next information about the parents' ages and their birthplaces would be considered secondary. Now, something I learned after carefully examining this certificate is that you'll notice that George is written in the center of the document, and then Roger was added later. Sometimes parents don't agree on a name, and maybe that's what occurred. But as I looked at this document closely, I noticed in the lower left-hand corner, it said the name was added from a supplemental in 1941. So it appears that George added the name Roger in 1941, and it says father's affidavit there. So maybe he was called Roger George all of those years, and they just never added it until later. Okay, an online database. This would be considered a compiled or derivative. However, as you drill down to each person page, you might find some sources, and those actual sources might be original. Here we have an obituary. An obituary could be considered, as we think about the information and its accuracy, think about the situation and who is providing the information for this obituary. Was it the person that was closest to the person that died? If so, they might be in emotional distress at the time, and the information might not already be very accurate or fully correct. Or is it provided by somebody a little further distant that might not know the answers to all of the questions? Here we have the Social Security Death Index. The title here, index, tells us that this is a derivative. However, this is a derivative that has some great value because if you think about how this index was created, it was created when a person showed their birth certificate to get a Social Security number. And then the person also had to have a death certificate submitted to get into this death index. So knowing how it was created, that a birth certificate and death certificate were examined, we can consider that the information in this is probably very accurate. Here we have a death record or death certificate. This is from the state of Indiana, and so we have this green color. This is a death certificate for Elizabeth Schultnick, who died the 7th of June, and the year is hard to see there, 19-something-8. But actually, maybe it's 1908. And it's Henry County, Dudley Township, Indiana. And we see that Elizabeth died and was 90 years old when she died. And her birth date is listed as the 12th of December, 1817. And her death, we already said, was the 7th of June. She's listed as a widow. The name of her husband is John Schultnick, and her birthplace is in Ohio. And her parents, we have a father listed as Jacob Fouts, born in North Carolina, and the mother is unknown. Okay, so this woman is 90 years old. The information about the death is primary. It was recorded at the time of death. So the date and place of death will be accurate. Now, who's providing the information about the birth? Probably not an eyewitness. So the information about the birth and even the parents will be considered secondary. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see who's the informant and who's providing the information. This is Jake Schultnick, who is her grandson. Okay, a passport. Now, a passport, that doesn't look like it has handwriting on it. However, so you might consider it as a derivative. However, think of the process that you go through to get a passport. We know that you have to submit a birth certificate and maybe even a social security card. So we know that this was created from looking at that birth certificate, which is a very good record. Okay, here we have a military record. This is a draft registration record, and it is for Freeman Edgar Whitaker, who is 28. He lists his birth date as the 12th of October, 1889, and his birthplace as Hillsboro, Indiana. Now, we can consider that this information will be accurate to his knowledge. He filled out this form and he provided the information. Now, I do have an ancestor that lied about his birth on a draft registration form. He was really 16, but he said he was 18. And so in that case, he had a motivation to lie. He wanted to be eligible. But in this case, Freeman is 28 years old, and so it's likely very accurate. Other information that you find on here, he has a wife and 2 children, and there's a description on the other half of the card or the other side of the card. A pension application, this is requesting benefits from the government. Anytime you're doing paperwork for the government, there will be lots of documentation required. And so very likely this information will be accurate. And on this document, he asks, the question is asked, are you married? And if so, to whom? And list your children and when they were born. So likely this is accurate. A book. Is a book always accurate? Just because something is published doesn't mean that it's actually correct. So use that information that would be considered derivative. I always use derivative information as a good clue. And then I look to see if I can find evidence to prove that it's correct or disprove it. Here we have a journal entry. Journals are great. They are original, and usually a person that keeps a journal writes the information at the time an event occurred, whether it was a birth, marriage, or death. And so that is one of the best records you can use if it was recorded at the time of the event by an eyewitness. Here we have an index to marriage records. Again, this is helpful, but we always want to get to the actual original record. In this case, we would want to get to the marriage record. Here we have a family Bible. It lists parents and their birth dates, and then it lists children. Usually you want to see that each of these entries were written at the time they occurred rather than all at once. These seem to be similar handwriting. However, this family Bible looks to have entries with different handwriting, different styles. So likely these were entered in at different times when the event occurred. Affidavits are sworn statements, often in front of a judge and in a court, and those can be considered as pretty accurate. Those are sworn testimonies. Here we have a declaration of intention to become a citizen. This should be accurate. It will give the name, it will give the age, the birth date, the birthplace, and the country they are leaving from, or when they arrived here and the country they left. Here we have a newspaper article. Just because it's in the newspaper doesn't mean that it's really accurate. However, it can provide some great clues. When many newspapers that are in small towns give some great information. If you're a small town, you may have information about a marriage in this case, and it may include information and description of the wedding dress, or maybe it would include information about who visited for Thanksgiving and what meal was served. So a small town newspaper can provide some great fun information. A baptism or christening record. This one is from Scandinavia, and here we see that the child was born on the 29th of June, 1845, and was also christened that very same day. So that is a great record that can be used in place of a birth record. This would hold the same weight, and it's considered original with primary information. Here we have an LDS membership record. Again, think about how it was created, when the information was provided, and that will help you weigh whether or not it's accurate. A driver's license, again, what's required to get a driver's license? What documents did you have to show? And then that will help you determine how accurate the birth information is. Okay, weigh the evidence. It will help us as we find that we have conflicting information about a birth, marriage, or death. We can look at the sources. If we know where they came from, then we can evaluate them and decide which is right. For example, if we have two birth dates, one comes from a birth certificate and one comes from a tombstone, we can think through the process. The birth certificate was created at the time of the birth by an eyewitness. The tombstone, the birth was provided by someone, but probably not an eyewitness, and it wasn't at the time of the birth. So in that case, we would consider the birth certificate more accurate for the date of birth. However, the tombstone may be accurate for the date of death. So I encourage you to try this process. See if you can answer some of your questions about which record is correct, and look very closely at all of the clues. You may find something that you missed in the past. Good luck. We'll see you next time.